Welcome. Thanks for joining us today for the 16th webinar in our series, We Believe Experiences Matter. I'm Jackie Smith, Marketing Assistant at Centric, and I'll be moderating the presentation. In today's webinar, Bob Schumacher will discuss usability in the contact center. Executive Vice President of GfK Centric, Bob has more than 25 years of professional experience in corporate and academic environments. Editor of the Handbook of Global User Research, the first book to focus on global user research, Bob has spent several years researching, designing, and testing enterprise applications for dozens of contact centers, including several Fortune 50 companies. Before I hand this over to Bob, if you have any questions during the presentation, please use the GoToWebinar dashboard to send them in, and I'll compile them for the Q&A at the end of the presentation. I'll also be monitoring the chat window, so if there are any technical issues, we will try to address those as best we can. You can also join the conversation today on Twitter at UserCentric using the hashtag UXLunch. Take it away, Bob.
Great. Thank you, Jackie. It's a pleasure to be here today. As Jackie mentioned, my name is Bob Schumacher. I'm Executive Vice President at UserCentric. I want to sort of take everybody back to the good old days here. Back before there was the internet, back before there was space and time even, it seems like. Because if you look at this picture, you see Billy in the upper left here. He's at a payphone, and he's sort of stuck and not sure what number it is that he wants to dial. And so he gets on the phone and he dials a number. He dials 411 and he talks to the directory assistance operator. The directory assistance operator at that point in time didn't have a screen in front of her. She had a telephone book. Well, we can fast forward a little bit. Let's think about this problem. We got Billy. Now Billy's back in the 1990s. And he goes to the local payphone and dials up and says, I'd like the number for mailboxes, etc. in Elgin, Illinois. And the directory assistance operator actually sees this screen right here that you see before her eyes. And she looks down there, she finds the right row, and then she moves over to the right, she quotes the right number. Well, this is how the process worked for the longest time. And then in the early 90s, three of my colleagues, Rick Olmanson, Scott Lively, and Arlie Lund, were tasked by Ameritech, and they were asked to see if they couldn't find a way to reduce the amount of time that people spent on the calls. And they didn't have a lot of parameters that they could work with. So they considered a number of things, and they came up with this change that you see in front of you now. It's very subtle, very subtle. And we'll go back. You can look at it again, and you can look at it here. So here you have thousands of directory assistance operators taking many calls, and you can see the old design here on the left and the new design here on the right. In fact, the changes are actually, there were really only two changes. This was the first, and I've highlighted just a couple of the rows here, but they are throughout. The first is that they went from all uppercase on the listing on the left to mixed case on the right, on the left column on the right side. The other change that they made was that they put a very subtle highlight. This isn't the actual highlight. I put that in there so that you could see the other change. But they put a highlight onto what row that the operator was looking at, so they could cursor up and down, and that helped them find the right column much easier than they could do before. The interesting thing is, you wouldn't think that the effect of these changes would be that much. And in fact, on a per call basis, it really wasn't that big of a change. It only made them 600 milliseconds faster. But when the average directory assistance call was 11 seconds and you've just taken off 600 milliseconds, you in fact can translate that into an annually recurring savings of $2.9 million, which is a significant sum of money, obviously, for any company, by making two very simple changes. So I want you to bear that in mind, and we're going to go through one more example. I want you to look at this screen. you see two very simple things. You see a circle and a star. I want you to answer this question with a yes or a no. So you can anticipate that. Here comes the question. The circle is above the star, yes or no? Okay, well that was pretty easy. It illustrates this, that it's a positive statement and it has an affirmative or a positive response. We're going to do it one more time. Say yes or no to the following. The circle is not above the star. Okay, that one was a little bit harder, but it illustrates a property of language that affects and forms our decision making. In this case, it's a negative statement with a no or a negative response. Okay, so a little bit of a parlor game here, but let's make it real for a minute. When we look at positive statements, they in fact evoke faster responses than negative statements. That's a very good thing, obviously. Yes responses are much faster than no responses, about 500 milliseconds, so about half a second. So let's see what we can do here. Okay, so it says place all service orders, yes or no? Okay, cancel all service orders with a no response. This is a positive set of positive statements. Okay. Do not cancel all service orders. Yes or no? Okay, those are both on the left side. Those are both affirmative responses. Well, you can also say do not place all service orders. No. Those are both negative responses, and you have a negative. They're negative statements with negative responses.
I don't know. I don't think so.
So what does this tell us? Different phrasings are used when you want different responses. In large variability in cognitive and represent large variability in cognitive processing times, and may have a significant impact on error. Okay. So how does this? What does this do? This really illustrates two key things. First, that there's an important measurement. If we can't measure things, like in the first example, if we can't measure the difference between the old design and the new design, we don't know what the impact of that is. Secondly, it also shows us the impact of design. There are very profound impacts of design and even profound impacts of small changes that can have very big effects. Okay? Well, what are we affecting and what are we measuring? Well, we're measuring and affecting behavior. At the end of the day, usability is all about measuring and changing user behavior. That's what we're trying to do. That's what we're trying to affect. That's what we're trying to impact whenever we look at a call center project. So what I'm going to do today is actually illustrate a few things about call centers. But I want to point out something that probably isn't in the contact center world. The highest cost in any contact center is that of human capital, and that is the amount of money, the amount of overhead, the amount of floor space that somebody takes up, all of the services that are done to improve the benefit of that user. So at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is to make the most efficient use of the people who are connected to the computers. But even more importantly, in many ways, the contact center operator is the face of the company to the customer. So we try to do the best that we can to give them the good tools so that they can represent the company in the best possible way. So what are we going to? The main part of what we're going to talk about today. Then I'm having a little bit of trouble with my machine here. Hang on. There we go. So let's talk about some of the issues about when we want to measure things, and because we know that measurement is important, but there are lots of times, lots of ways, lots of things that we can measure. Let's set some foundations here. So let's assume that this was the base model of the application. So This is what the operators or the representatives are currently using, and they're going to be using this brand new shiny user interface. But how do we know that the new shiny interface is better? It's not better just because it's a graphical user interface. In many ways, you can design green screens that are faster and better than graphical interfaces. You assume a certain amount of training and a certain amount of knowledge, and green screens can work as well, if not better, than a graphical user interface. So it is an open question. Okay, so what we really want to understand is when we take a look at any measurement protocol or any measurement activity, we want to understand the current performance level. So on the left axis, what we have is some sort of measurement. It could be time, it could be error, it could be satisfaction, anything that any measurement by which we understand the performance of our contact center employees. And it has a certain baseline, and that baseline goes from early stage to later to some late point in time. So you have time on the horizontal axis. And the reason why we call it phase of deployment is because we're assuming that we're going to add another application into the mix. So anytime you add a new application into the mix, there's a learning curve. There's a learning deficit that's going to there's some curve by which we understand that somebody learns the application. This is basic psychology here, but let's break it down a little bit. The question that we often want to ask when we look at the contact center is how much of a hit is there going to be when the new application goes out. We represent that by the distance between the current performance level and the initial performance decrement. So that vertical space between the top of the red line and the green line. The object, of course, is to minimize that amount of time so that somebody can come in and learn the application as quickly as possible. But that's not the only thing that we can measure, and that actually is pretty easy to measure. We'll get to that in a bit. The second point that we can measure is the distance between the beginning of the curve and the point at which it crosses over the current baseline performance. So the question is, when does the current performance return to where it was supposed to be, where it was before? We call this the lag time. So that's a very important part to understand when the performance gets to where it previously was, so that you know at least the items in the or the measures that are taken in the call center will return to at least to their baseline level. But that ultimately is not why we do a redesign. That's not why we do change. We do change because we want to understand the long-term benefit. We want to understand the return on that investment. And that's measured by the distance between the green line and the leveling or the asymptote of the learning curve of the red line. So the long-term benefit of the new interface is the amount of eventual improvement that's going to happen. And that's the recurring benefit of any change or any new application that's put into the mix. So if we look at those three things together, number one, we're looking at the initial performance decrement, which is the height of the curve relative to the green line. The distance between the initial startup and the crossover, which is the lag time, or the lag time lag, as I have up there now, and then the long-term benefit, which is the spread between the current performance and the supposed future performance. The question is, though, how do we get those three things? How do we understand what those are so that we do get that benefit from whatever investment we make into the application? Well, I'll come to that in a few minutes, but let's talk about what if we look at the performance characteristics of the new application and say we can do better. We can make a better design. We can do things better than what we supposed. That will decrease the performance decrement, shorten the lag, and increase or decrease the performance relative to the current measure and handle time, for example. We can also screw up and make a poor design. So typically how we would want to look at the learning curves and how they look at how we would look and see what performance looks like in a variety of change environments. Okay, so to kind of get to the meat of the application here, of the discussion here today, I want to talk about this is really a process model. So if we're going to measure, one of the key things that we think about when we're doing user experience is that we are measuring and changing, and measuring and changing. Measurement is done in a variety of ways, and change is done through design. So I have a very simplistic model that we'll break down. The first thing that we want to do is we want to measure by measuring the benchmark performance. Then we go into some sort of, we feed that information forward and go into a discovery phase where we learn about those things that can be changed and should be changed, and we feed that forward into design where there's a cycle which allows us to spit out a better design, and then we can re-benchmark or look at those figures again at the end. Now, if we sort of unpack that a little bit, there are a couple of different activities we can do during discovery. The first is observing the use of the system and conducting the expert evaluation, which feeds us into doing things like into the design phase, which would be making design changes, conducting the workshops, and then it really in a repeated cycle of doing design workshops and changes and modeling the performance, possibly checking to see have we reached our goals, our user experience goals, and if we have, then we move that out and write requirements. So let's take a look at benchmark performance first. When we look at performance, ultimately, and this is very simplistic, of course, performance is what is the end of that curve. So it is a comparison of what the end performance is relative to the baseline performance that we collected. And so we can often use, where do we get these benchmarks? Well, we can use existing measures. The one thing about contact centers in general is that there are a lot of measures out there. We just have to make sure that they're good, reliable, valid, that they've measured the same things over time, and that they give us a decent picture of how the implementation of an application is going to be affected in the call center. So if you put out an application and you don't have a measure that's going to be sensitive enough to tell you whether the application is working or not working, then it's not a good measure. Okay. Next, any outcome measured after the redesign should be measured before the redesign. It sounds simple, but I've seen cases where we take one set of measures at the beginning and a different set of measures at the end, and we say we've improved. But unless you're doing a test retest on the same sorts of measures in an equivalent environment, it's very hard to make those comparisons. Also, and this gets back to the point that I was speaking about just a moment ago, indirect measures such as customer satisfaction are really often buried in a lot of other factors. They're buried in brand. They're buried in how people experience the call center, if they've had a bad day or the IVR's overloaded and they can't get through. So customer sat is a very insensitive measure to baseline performance of users of call center technologies. So it would be misleading to take certain kinds of applications or certain kinds of measurements and assume that they are reflecting the performance of the application. So we got to make sure, of course, and again, this is almost simplistic, but it's very difficult. I mean, you can't really collect all the measures you need, the baseline measures, after the redesign is deployed. So, in other words, you've got to do one set of measures before the application goes in, make the application changes, and then collect the same measures and compare those two. So what kinds of things are we measuring? Well, first, there's some conditions that we have to set up. in order to do a benchmark measure, we need to have some kind of detailed, controlled measure of user behavior. And this is, in our words, we call this either a summative test or a quantitative test, something where we're not really getting attitude and opinion. We are really getting at behavior. We're getting at what people do. And it's unambiguous, and it's very well controlled. So that might be, we'll get to the measures in a second, but there are a couple of different ways that we can measure. First, we can measure the applications in actual use out on the floor with the agents. The issue here, of course, is that you never have the same kind of call going from one moment to the next. Nevertheless, with a high enough call volume and a reasonably predictable call distribution, you can collect enough sample side by side with an agent that it can be, we can record these and really look at certain kinds of measures, either time or satisfaction, or particularly in cases side by side in actual use, we would look at error. We can also look at simulated use, and this is what we've done in several occasions. We'd go into a call center where there's going to be a change made, would be a new application put forth, and we would take agents offline for about an hour and give them very directed tasks and without any interruptions, so that they could go through and enter an order or make a change to an account or resolve a billing record. And either in a simulated database or in a live database where the data are corrected, and we can go back and reuse those same accounts over and over. It allows us the opportunity to take very specific and controlled measures across time and across people. So we would prefer doing these kinds of measures in a controlled environment if possible. It also in a controlled environment, we can do a better job of controlling networks and things like that often provide a lot of lag and uncertainty into the measurements. But what is it that we measure? Well, typically, one of the first things that would leap to mind would be a time to complete on a specific kind of task. So what would if we have a specific order that we wanted to put in, we would measure that from the point at which information was given. Excuse me. At the time at which information was given to the agent until that order was essentially complete. We would also want to look at error. There are a lot of different kinds of errors, and so I guess I'm too loud. All right. There are a lot of different kinds of errors that people make, and so you could look at errors where they forgot to do something or they omitted doing something, or you could look at errors where they committed, they went down the wrong path and completed the wrong order type, for example, ordered the wrong item. In a lot of telecom or utility kinds of environments, errors can be very costly. So if an agent puts in an error for a truck roll, for example, when a truck roll wasn't needed because they failed to go to a certain screen or pick up a certain data element, that's a pretty serious error because there's a direct cost to the business in doing that. You can also look at efficiencies that would be the number of screens visited or the way that certain screens are processed or filled out. In other words, the things to measure are those things that are most important to understanding how that curve is going to be bent based upon the meaning or purpose of the application. Last, it is possible to collect measures of satisfaction or preference, although they don't really mean as much in this case because we're getting very detailed and controlled information. But if you're testing, if you design two different kinds of interfaces and you want to do measurements, baseline measurements of two different interfaces to do the same function, it is possible to have either two different sets of users or the same users work with both applications and then either give a preference or some sort of satisfaction rating between the two. Okay, so that was benchmarking performance. Let's take a look at some things that can be done in the discovery phase in observation of the usage of the system and conducting the expert evaluations. First, when we do observations of system use and try to get direct user feedback, what we're really talking about is going out side by side, visiting call centers in person, and watching what people do, understanding what the representatives say, how they flow through the calls, what are the natural things. But I want to stress, before I get into this further, I want to stress we want to know what people do. And that's important because for those of you who watch or are fans of House, you know that what people say is not what they do. So we can talk to people all day long. We can listen to people all day long. But it's more important, or often more important, to look at what they do, and especially if there are dissociations between what people do and what people say, that gives us a clue. We also want to see, just sit side by side, to see how the screen flow will match the conversation flow. What does the customer lead with? What's the customer question? What's the business response to that? How does the screen flow match what the customer says and what the business wants to have done? The other thing, just to get a feel for the environment, looking at the desks of the agents. What tools do they have tacked to the wall? What other applications are they using? How similar are the applications that they use from one system to the other? We've been in some call centers where agents have to know and use as many as 20 different applications across their day. Sometimes they'll use 7 or 8 on a single phone call. And they've all been done by different people who haven't understood the ecosystem. So really watching all of those things and watching how people interact is very essential in the discovery phase before we move into trying to make any kind of change. Next, if you can't observe, and in some cases in financial systems occasionally, in banking systems, it's very hard to get people offline or get people into the center, I should say, and sit side by side and watch things as they happen. It is possible to do focus groups, but now what we're doing is listening to what people say. So we need to be very careful about taking all of those learnings and running them through a filter of maybe a demo of the system or other ways to take a look at what the application actually looks like and how people are supposed to do it. There are other means other than just side by side or remote. Some folks or some contact centers do their quality control by observing through recorded calls on systems like Qfinity, for example, and contacts can be observed there. You can see how people move through the screens and hear what the customers say and what the reps say, but you can't see the environment, and there's still a lot of richness, a lot of data that can be gathered simply by sitting side by side and in between calls asking a few very directed and very, very informational questions to get at more information. Another thing, and this doesn't fit with the others quite as much, but it's really an important component of understanding any contact center. What are the incentives for the individual? How are the representatives incented for doing their jobs? And because those individual incentives are going to drive behaviors. And if the screen flow is out of sync with the business flow here, that may be perturbed simply because we've changed the incentive structures for the agents, it begins to change how we view and how we work with those applications. So any new application is going to have to take into account that there are certain sales processes or service processes, policies, procedures that are wrapped around all of this and part of the discovery process. Another thing that we like to do, and we think this is very valuable because there are often a great many things that users will never say. So For instance, the very first example that I showed with the all uppercase font, I would virtually guarantee you that none of my colleagues at the time heard from the directory assistance agents that, wow, if you make that font in mixed case, I'll be able to do this faster. There are just things, that we as human factors and usability people know about how people are wired, that we can make changes that are independent of what we'll hear from the reps. So there's a certain amount of knowledge in the field and knowledge and expertise about how people are wired that we can bring to the context. So any human factors person worth their salt should be able to look at a lot of screens and be able to give you good feedback. There's also, we look at weaknesses of design, but those weaknesses of design usually translate into things like inefficiency of screen flow, poor screen layout, and even missing functionality if there are things, if we're doing certain kinds of activities like a cognitive walkthrough where we're going to go through and actually simulate use ourselves and try to understand what people do in certain situations. So we might even do some sort of guided evaluation through here as well with agents. So that's the discovery part. So the whole purpose of discovery, of course, is to gain an understanding of how systems are used, and then do a level set understanding of where the issues with the current applications are, if that's indeed the target. So we collect a lot of stuff, and now we take that stuff and we apply it to design, which is the next the next steps here. One of the first things that we would want to do once we gather enough information here in the discovery phase is we want to conduct a design workshop. The point of the design workshop is to take the wisdom of the domain experts and combine that with the experience and the expertise of a UI team. And it doesn't just have to be a UI team, but principally it should be UI design workshops. And in order to do this well, you need to have a combination of the people who know the job well, not supervisors who think they know the job well, but the actual reps who are talking to customers on a daily basis, on an hourly basis. Maybe there's somebody from IT in there. Maybe there's somebody from one of the business units involved here. But typically, we want to make sure that the core set of people, and it's a small set of people, so they can move quickly, go through a design exercise where we actually look at all the screens, we look at the assumptions, we challenge how things are done, and then we come up with a hypothesis about how we might be able to do it better. And we'll bring that to bear in designs down the way. It provides us an efficient way to understand all of the requirements as best we can. And at the end of the day, if you can say that you've done this with the reps, they're going to buy into it if we've done a good job with it. And usually the management is going to buy into it as well. So the design workshops are essential to sort of seed the process. But it's not the end of the process, because we're going to take we take the discovery, we feed it into a design workshop, and then the UI team should go off and sketch out whatever new design that they feel is going to be appropriate. Now I'm being a little bit simplistic here, because a large application is going to take many rounds and a lot of time to complete. If we're talking about a relatively small addition to an existing application, there may be a few screens that have to be done, and it can be done in a few days or a couple weeks. But typically, we want to take the discovery, take the design workshop information, and feed that into an information architecture, information design step, put that into Sketch, and then move to wireframe and prototype, but we don't do that in those steps in sequence one right after another. We do want to test at each one of these points. So we can test the architecture in certain ways. We can test the sketches without anything ever being built. We can test the wireframes without them going to writing a lot of code. And we can do the same with the prototypes. Each company has its own process and software method to do this, and that's not the point of this webinar, so I'm not going to get into any more detail about it. But the point is, we want to make the changes, make them faster, use a user-centered design approach where we're going to design, change, design, change, design, change, and we change based upon what we learn. I'm going to take a brief detour here and talk a little bit about something that I think is emerging and something that we're doing, starting to do more and more, and that is modeling the performance, which allows us to really get a handle on what the performance is going to be like, the user interface performance is going to be like before it gets out in the field. In other words, the far right end of that curve. So if we're really looking at an application that is in need of understanding or in need of making performance better or more efficient, it is possible to do performance modeling. And I can't go into detail because it's a whole webinar in itself to talk about GOMS, but ultimately what this cognitive model is an estimation of how long a task will take on different interfaces. And in effect, what we're doing is we're putting it in a wind tunnel before we actually build it, which is a strong benefit and will reduce the cost in the long run. So this modeling, this cognitive modeling, is built on something called the Model Human Processor, and it was developed back in the 80s and is still sort of living a life at this point in time, because it allows the estimation of performance without taking measurements in the field. So we can assume how long it's going to take somebody to see something, to think about it, and to react to it. And we can evaluate that performance at the end of the curve. So it's really intended to get to this far right side. And if we can estimate that in a design phase, then in fact we've reduced the uncertainty even more to whether we're going to be above the green line or below the green line, and then how far. It will also help us estimate how far below the line we're going to be. And like I mentioned, it's based on empirically validated results. It involves breaking down the tasks into smaller components, things like mouse movements and control usage, and how many times people have to enter things on the keyboard. And it gives values to each of the steps, and then the sum of the steps is the time for the task. We've done this in several occasions. We're able to predict reliably one design being better than another design. So it can save us quite a bit of time. There are a lot of different tools that exist. There's a tool called CogTool that's freely available for people to look at and play with. There's another one from measuringusability.com by Jeff Sorrow called Composite KLM. We recommend at least exploring these as options. So once we've done a design, once we've done a sketch, we've done a wireframe, at each one of these steps we want to review, we want to look at those design changes and make a decision, because we've done the design, we've done some testing, and when the design is complete, we have to approve it. We should make sure that that has gone through enough field review that we feel comfortable that we've achieved what we wanted to achieve. And the requirements, the UI requirements, in an ideal world would be completed before a stick of code is ever written. If we can do that, then we have a high degree of confidence that what the users are going to use, in fact, has been validated through testing, and then through prototyping, and maybe even through modeling, and we know what the end result's going to be. We can also understand where in the curve we are. And I'll show that curve again in just a minute here. So once we got a complete design, the system's deployed, performance can be measured again, and it can be compared against the previous design. The same measures are used as used before, and now we can make those decisions whether we've actually achieved our objective. So the three different points of the curve that we're looking at, have we affected the learnability of the application, which is really the lag time? Have we affected the initial shock, which is the performance decrement? The easy-to-learn applications are going to decrease the decrement and decrease the time lag. But you could have an easy-to-learn, easy-to-use application which may in fact not provide the long-term benefit because it has too many steps. It's a wizard that doesn't take advantage of users' ability to become faster over time, which is another reason why modeling would be really good. Now, if you go back to the one text-based interface screen that I showed, that's really has a very steep learning curve, but it is very fast for people who have stuffed all that information into their head. So the long-term performance is going to be very good, but the cost to get there per person is really high. So there's always going to be a trade-off between, you know, if you have a high turnover in your center, an easier to learn application is going to be of value because now you know you have to focus on the front end of that curve. If you've got an environment where people are going to stay for a long time or it's very complicated, you want to make an application that might require a steeper learning curve but has a longer benefit over time, which is the spread between, or the spread at 0.3. So that is that's it for today. I covered a few things. I think there are a few questions. Let me repeat those. If we benchmark before and after with simulated use both times, how accurate are the results compared with those we'd get benchmarking both times with actual use? Well, you know, you can't really compare simulated use to actual use because simulated use is always going to be done on a varied set. I'm sorry. Actual use is always going to be done on a varied set of, it's never going to be exact same context day after day because people change how they talk. You know, they're different callers. They want to call and talk about how their dog is behaving today, and so actual use, when you look at an average handle time number, it's such a large number that it looks pretty stable, but on a smaller basis across 30 or 40 or 50 contacts, there's a lot of variability, and so it depends. You know, your sampling rates are going to affect how your actual times are going to appear. But with simulated, and I really like simulated for doing comparison, with simulated, you have exactly the same conditions before as you're going to have after because you're going to use the same test questions and the same test data, and that means you've got a much more controlled environment. So I would always opt, if it's possible, I would always opt to do simulated, but I would collect actual as well just because I think there's a political benefit to that as well. Next question. Do you recommend working with experienced reps or new ones when testing systems? What about in design workshops? That's a good question. Well, we tend to want to test at both ends of the spectrum. It depends upon your contact center whether you have what an experienced rep is, because in some centers where the turnover is 100% a year, an experienced rep might be somebody who's there you know, for 3 years. In other places, in a let's say highly technical center, an experienced rep might be somebody who's there 20 years. So I would like to get people, I think, who are at the more experienced point of the curve to do the testing for the most part, because you don't want to confound the testing, the long-term understanding of those differences with learning. So I would opt to get people at the far end. Now, what that doesn't tell you, though, is how new reps are going to adapt. And we're seeing more and more that if learning is important, and reps that have been there 20 or 30 years who are used to using certain kinds of character-based interfaces, and all of a sudden you throw a Facebook or a Facebook-like application or a social media application, that people can bring in a lot of outside knowledge into the domain. You might have the new reps might adapt a lot faster than the old reps. So I think the short answer is I'd probably use experienced reps, and if I get the opportunity to get both experienced and new reps, I would take both, and that would help me look at not only how the training is going to go for people who are currently on the line, but also the training parameters for new people in the next new hire class, for example. What's the training curve going to look like there? Because that's one of those measures that we really would want to understand. In design workshops, I think we need the experience of the experienced reps. I won't be quite so wishy-washy on that one. I'd rather have people who have the right attitude but also have the right experience. Okay. Next question. Is it okay to design a test in the U.S. if more of your reps are based in other countries? Well, I think I'm not quite sure exactly what this is pointed at, but you can design a test in the U.S., and if you're going to test reps in the U.S., but most of your reps are based outside the U.S. in India, the Philippines, or Panama, for example, I think I'd probably want to go and test in country. That would be my suggestion there. If you test folks in the U.S., you just don't know how dissimilar they are. I mean, you can look at all the numbers, and if the numbers are not that different between an outsourced center or an offshore center and an onshore center, then the results are probably going to be comparable. But if you see other characteristics that are going to affect how people are going to perform in different centers. I mean, even in the U.S., this isn't even an offshore-onshore issue. There are some centers in the U.S., for some of our clients, some centers have much different characteristics than others, and so you see wildly different performance for the same kinds of activities in different centers. So even sampling within the U.S., it's both a practical and a political decision. But to get the real answers, I would want to do that probably in country. Next question. Our call centers are comprised of divisions with very different, what's that word? Very different roles, but they all use the same system. How can we handle this without testing with hundreds of users? You know, I actually think it's not so much the role, but the kind of call. If you have sales associates separate from service associates, separate from testing, or troubleshooting representatives, if they all take the same kind of call, and you look at the call dispositions and see that on a call type of updating a billing record, for instance, they all have very similar characteristics, I think you can get away with testing only one of those roles. However, if they're doing things different in those centers, taking the same kind of call but doing things different, I probably would want to, I'd probably recommend testing with those different roles. But it's really less about the role and more about the specific task that they do. If the tasks are the same, I think you can get away with testing only with one of the roles. Okay. These are good questions. Last question here. You briefly mentioned guided evaluations. Does this involve the end user who has domain knowledge, and when in the redesign process would you recommend this technique? You know, when we first start to do our discovery, excuse me, when we first start to do our discovery, we will take a lot of time to sit down with 2 or 3 or more reps. Sometimes we'll use trainers because they're pretty good too. They know the ins and outs. But we'll want to get a very detailed walkthrough of each of the tasks that people do, and each of the deviations from that task, I guess. You know, what's normal, what's not normal. And so we do it usually right after it's in the discovery phase, right after we would go through the side-by-side observations. I mean, we have to have enough knowledge that we can ask good questions in a guided walkthrough and a guided evaluation. And so during that evaluation period, we'll go through, we'll identify areas of concern that we'll use in the workshop. So yeah, I didn't discuss that very much, but usually it's much more nuanced. We would want to get an initial walkthrough of the application, then we do side-by-sides, then we'll do a very detailed walkthrough on the way the applications are serve the tasks, and then we go into workshopping. So that by the time we hit the workshop, we can't run the application, but we know the lingo, we know the application reasonably well, and we can track with things that are going on, because these are often highly specialized applications and domains, and knowing the product, we don't know the product, we don't know how it's ordered, serviced, marketed, and so we've got to get a lot of that before we can go in and be knowledgeable and helpful in the workshop. So is that it? Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for attending today. The recording of the presentation will be available on YouTube and Vimeo with links from our website, usercentric.com. We'll tweet it when it's live, and thanks again.